Okay guys, welcome back. Today I want to talk about a case study that was really meaningful for a couple of reasons. One was very important for the history of nuclear power in the United States, and also very meaningful and important for how human factors was viewed in the context of complex systems. So this event is known as the 3 Mile Island nuclear event, and it refers to what ended up becoming a partial core meltdown that happened on Unit 2 of 3 Mile Island March 28, 1979. So some of you may even remember this. It happened in a little town just outside of Middleton, Pennsylvania. The plant itself is located on what's known as the Susquehanna River, which you can see here. Here are the two units in the power plant. So Unit 1 and Unit 2 are housed in these containers that you can see in the picture. And these are called containment buildings. And then of course you have the cooling towers over here. So again, this was a really important event because it was very, it was not human factors and how the operator did his job was appreciated, but it wasn't really understood what would happen if the operator failed in a major situation like this. Obviously, or maybe not so obviously, but the event that occurred happened because of equipment malfunctions, but also design problems and operator failures, operator errors as the event unfolded. And so what I want to do today is really take a look at a detailed level at how this event took place. So what the failures were, and then I want to take a deep dive into what the human errors were, the human factors that were involved in this event. And so I'll probably break this talk up into two sections just for time. With the first, we'll focus on the event itself, and then the second, we'll talk about the human factors issues. Okay, so before we get started, I wanted to just do a quick refresher on how nuclear power operations work. You might have watched the video that I also posted on, produced by Arriva, on how nuclear power works, so this will just be a quick refresher. Again, there's a primary system over here and a secondary system here. This system here is sometimes called the tertiary system, but it's not really important for this example. Just to refresh, the magic really starts in the reactor core area. This is where the nuclear fuel lives. And this fuel is held in long kind of columns which are held together by what's called cladding. So that's often zirconium cladding that protects or holds together the uranium or the nuclear fuel itself. Okay, so those fuel rods live in the reactor core, and those fuel rods are surrounded by water that flows in and out of the reactor core. And so water flows through the reactor core, and it touches the fuel rods, and it's sent to what's called a steam generator. So that steam generator is really just a heat exchanger. And so the hot radioactive water from the primary system that's just come out of the core is sent through the steam generator or a heat exchanger, and as it moves along or moves down in the steam generator, it basically cools off, and we'll talk about where that heat goes later. But now cooler radioactive or primary system water is sent out of the steam generator by a reactor coolant pump and back up into the core again, where it starts the process over. So again, when it comes out of the core on the hot leg here, it's very hot, and when it comes into the core through the cold leg, it's not as hot. Okay, let's see if I can change my colors here. So the next piece that's a little bit interesting is what's known as the secondary system. So the secondary system really wants to take advantage of all the hot energy that's been produced in primary system. And so secondary system consists of a series of tunnels, a series of piping, which starts with the condenser. It actually starts out here at the cooling tower, and where auxiliary feed water is pulled from both the cooling tower or from the lake or from the river or wherever this plant is operating, and that main feed water is now sent into the steam generator to try and capture some of that heat. So you can see that the secondary system never actually touches water in the primary system, but heat is transferred through the heat exchanger effect. So now warm secondary water, hot secondary water, which has been heated by the steam generator, is sent to the turbine and to the generator, where it turns into electrical power. Actually, I should be more specific here. Once that steam has been sent through the turbine it's resent out to the cooling tower, where it's sprinkled down and it's pretty steamy here, but eventually condenses into a little pool that you have at the bottom of the cooling tower. And again, that's what goes to continue to feed the steam generator in the secondary system. Okay. One other thing I wanted to point out, and that is, let's go back to the primary system. So if you remember anything about kind of basic physics, you kind of remember what happens when water gets hot, especially in a closed system. Well, when water gets hot, it expands. And so because the primary system is a closed system, there has to be a way to control for the expansion of this water, the primary containment water, as the temperature changes. And that's where this guy comes in handy. This is called the pressurizer. So this pressurizer allows you to basically help control water temperature by allowing the primary water to move through the volume of this pressurizer. So as water gets hotter, it has nowhere to go, it will fall into this pressurizer area. And this is important because as a closed system, and we'll see what happened with the 3 Mile Island incident, this is important because this was really a way to help control what happens in primary system. So a couple things I want to note to you. If this pressurizer starts to fill up because the water's heating up so much and expanding so much, if it had to, there's a little escape route for it. And so that's where it goes here, into this pressurized operated relief valve. So you can see that there's a pressurized operated relief valve here, and that will be dumped into a pressurized relief tank if it heats up too much. But this isn't really intended for regular operations. You wouldn't always have a port, in use. That's really for emergency operations, as we'll talk about in a few minutes. But that's basically the nuts and bolts of nuclear power plant. A very, very simple power plant here. And again, the idea that I want you to keep in mind is that you have a primary system, a secondary system, and you also have these pumps located along the way to help move this water along. Okay, so let's talk about what happened on the early morning of March 28th, 1979. So again, this is Unit 2, and the control room operators had really been on duty all night long. These guys usually run about a 12-hour shift. So it was towards the middle to towards the end of their shift when something bad happened. What happened was this main feed water pump died out, and it's that main feed water pump is what sends water on the secondary side to the steam generator. So when that happened, an automatic trip happened, and the control rods dropped. So that means control rods dropped into the reactor core, and control rods are kind of an automatic way of shutting down the core. After the reactor core tripped, or after the reactor tripped, pressure in the primary system began to rise. Ultimately, as the pressure began to rise, this guy started to fill up. Remember that? This is the pressurizer. So when pressure starts to rise, this thing gets higher and higher. And ultimately, it got so high that the pressure-operated relief valve really opened up. And so it had to dump extra inventory out of the pore. And so that went this way into the relief tank. And so this valve opened up. The problem was that once and when it opened up, the pressure began to drop, and I'll show you here, and this level started to go down. Let's see if the eraser works. No, it doesn't. Okay, so after the water started to be ejected out of the pore, then the pressure started to drop, then the pressurizer went down. Now the problem was that the pore should have closed at that point, if you recall. Once pressure was reached, this guy should have closed, and it should have maintained a closed system again. The problem was that pore never actually closed, so it stopped it from being a closed system. As a result, coolant continued to flow out of the primary system through the pore uncontrolled. So there was enough information available to the operators at this point, or not really enough information available to the operators at this point. So for example, there wasn't any indication of how much water covered the core. They didn't know if water was here or here or here. All they knew was pressure and temperature. And as a result, the operators assumed that when the pressure was high, the core was covered. Okay? So the alarms began to rise, and the operators didn't really realize at the time that they were experiencing a loss of coolant accident. And another piece was, we'll talk about this in a minute, they were being given indication that this pore over here was indeed closed, when in fact it was open. So when the alarms began to ring, they didn't realize that they were losing water because they thought that pore was closed. The primary side pressure dropped so much that the reactor coolant pumps eventually had to be shut off to reduce cavitation. So this is the reactor coolant pump here. And when the water began to drop, and there's no water in the coolant pump, then it begins to cavitate. And if it cavitates and vibrates too much, you can experience a breakage in the pipe known as a large LOCA, a large break LOCA, they call it, loss of coolant accident. So now they were trying to prevent the pressurizer from filling up completely, and so they had to reduce how much cooling water was being pumped into the primary system. So when you know you're losing water, you're going to refill it with additional cooling water, and they had to be careful about putting too much water in the primary system because they never want the pressurizer to go solid. The problem was they didn't have a real indication of how much water was in there to begin with. So eventually what ended up happening was the reactor core eventually started to lose enough water, and the core itself became uncovered, and that's when the fuel pellets began to melt. In fact, the fuel pellets first melted the zirconium cladding that I mentioned before, and ultimately began to melt. When they later looked at this system, they found that about half of the core melted during the early stages of the accident. So let's take a closer look at the pore itself. And I think this is important for you guys to understand, because if you understand how this pore operated and how it was designed, you might have a better understanding of how the operators kind of misunderstood the information once they were in the control room in the situation. So what you're looking at here is a diagram of the pore, and it's the same diagram, but on the left you'll see that this is the pore in its closed position, and on the right it's here obviously in its open position. And to understand this, we kind of have to look at how the pore works, or how it's actuated. So this is really the part we're interested in here, and I'll get rid of that so we can continue to make our marks. And And what you'll see is that the PORV is really controlled by this guy. This is the solenoid. So when that solenoid is activated or receives a signal, what it does is it drops the plunger, and this lever is then depressed this way. When the lever goes down, this plunger then goes down and pushes on this plug right here. So this plug is held up by the spring, and when the plunger depresses it down, then the plunger moves down, right? And so when it does that, it actually creates a pathway. I'll do this in blue so you can see the pathway is opened. Now the inventory can exit into the pressurizer relief tank. So that's how the PORV basically works. And I wanted to point out something. You know, when we're looking at the PALV or the PORV, the engineers designed this to fail closed. So they designed it over here to when it does not receive a signal, or when that solenoid is not activated, then the plunger head remains up, and through that path that we just looked at, there's a blockage here, so the inventory can't exit. So it fails closed. In the absence of power, it fails closed. Okay. So how does this relate to what the operator saw in the control room that day? Well, the interesting thing is when this solenoid over here is actuated or receives or is energized, a signal is also sent to the control room to light up the PORV indicator. And so that light in the control room lights up and says to the control room operators, hey guys, PORV is open. Now that's interesting. There's a fine line here, because what it's really saying is it's not saying the PORV is open, it's just saying that solenoid is activated. But to the operators, they were trained and they understood the system to work such that when they saw the light being turned on, they understood the PORV to be open. So it didn't cross their mind at the time to think, oh, wait a second, this isn't a signal of the PORV being open, this is just a signal of the solenoid being activated. They didn't understand that in their mental model. So they really didn't have a true picture of what was actually happening, and it really stopped them from questioning, wait a second, maybe this thing's just stuck. I know how this works. Maybe the solenoid is activated, but the plunger head is stuck. And indeed, that's what actually happened, right? So in the actual case, the solenoid was activated, but the plunger didn't depress. Okay, that's what actually happened. So think about this from a design standpoint. You know, if your engineering design is a little bit off, and couple that with the mental model being off of the operators, it can result in some pretty bad problems. Let me show you another problem that bubbled up during this event. What you're looking at here is just on the left is just a picture of the folks in the control room during the event. But on the right, you'll notice a control panel with all these tags on it. This is actually pretty important. So if you remember, after the control rods dropped, they were a couple minutes into the event at this point, the emergency core cooling system was automatically activated so that this extra water could be pushed into the RCS, or the reactor cooling system, the primary side. So do you remember what happened? Yeah, at that time, the ECCS, the emergency core cooling system, actually failed to start. But at that time, the operators didn't realize that it had failed. So they were sitting there for a minute thinking that the cooling system was, working and pumping nice cool inventory back into the RCS, but all the while nothing was happening, and they continued to lose inventory because if you remember, that PORV was open. So it's sitting there just pouring out of the primary system, not being refilled. So eventually they thought it was working, thought it was reestablishing inventory, and so eventually they walked over and even turned off ECCS and switched it over to manual. So they took it out of automatic and switched it over to manual, and essentially they deactivated this emergency core cooling system. So this is interesting because later testimony from the operators on duty at the time said that they actually looked over at the ECCS. I mean, this is part of their regular procedures. They looked over, and what they confirmed was that the core cool, or the indicator lights for the ECCS, were actually covered up. And so what happened was actually the system was being maintained earlier that week. And so they had these kind of indicator tags or warning tags placed over the controls themselves to warn the operators uh, of maintenance. And these adjacent tags were actually covering up very important information. So from a human factors design standpoint, this was obviously something that could have been done much better. So let's talk quickly about what this event did to the industry and how it changed generally the role of human factors. This was a terrible incident, and certainly would hope to never see this again, certainly in the US or the world. But I think there were a lot of lessons learned and a lot of takeaways that were received as a result of this. One of the major issues in my mind is kind of this change in perspective and how the industry viewed human performance and how the industry began to view the human operator as a critical role in a critical part in overall plant safety. Resulting from this event, a number of regulations were established, like New Reg 0711, which basically outlined an entire human factors methodology that designers should incorporate in the design and management of a plant, all the way to external entities being established, like the Institute of Nuclear Power Operators, INPO, which is based out of Atlanta. And INPO is really a kind of a industry developed and industry maintained self-policing group to help keep them honest and help keep the utilities in the country informed about other ongoings and sister plants. I wanted to also point out that, this was a terrible event, but to put it in context, I don't think a lot of people do tons of research on these types of events. And when we hear nuclear and we hear, radiation exposure, of course we think, the worst. We think Chernobyl and possibly Fukushima. And in this case, it's actually interesting because they've done a lot of research and obviously monitoring on this site and on this plant since the event itself. And it was interesting to find that, for the total population in that area of Middleton, Pennsylvania, it's about 2 million people, I think they estimate. People only received about 1 milligram of radiation exposure as a result of this event. And just to put that in context, we receive about 100 milligrams of exposure per year just from natural sources like the earth and the sun and that kind of thing. And, if you're looking at a chest x-ray, going to the doctor, a chest x-ray gives you about 6 milligrams of exposure. So 1 milligram of exposure was somewhat moderate relative to some of the other exposures that we have. Of course, as we know, we don't want any of it because it's cumulative and doesn't go away. But overall, it seemed to be marginal in exposure. I also wanted to point out to you that at this point, 3 Mile Island Unit 2 is completely shut down. And all the water has been removed from primary and secondary systems, and all of the used nuclear fuel has been sent for decommissioning elsewhere in the United States. So that guy is completely shut down and not in operation anymore. Okay, with that, I think we've talked enough about 3 Mile Island. I hope you'll take a look at the site to see some of the other materials I've posted for you. And certainly feel free to give me a call or an email if you all have any questions.